My boyfriend Tony and I had been together for 3 years, and I never met his family. He'd met my parents many times before. Since we got together, we spent every Christmas and Thanksgiving with them. We also went to visit my cousins in California several times. Everything was great and my family loved him, but I always thought it was weird that I never got to meet his family. He always had good things to say about his parents and his older brother Tom, so I didn't know why he wouldn't introduce us. Tony's excuse was that they lived so far away, but we still could have talked on Zoom or on the phone. I had the feeling that he might not have liked them as much as he said he did, but I wasn't sure. Then one day I found out that I had to go on a business trip to Kansas City, which is where Tony is from, so I figured it would be the perfect opportunity to finally meet his family. I told Tony about it, and he didn't seem too happy with the idea. I asked him why, and he said that he couldn't afford to go with me. I asked him if that was the only excuse, and he said yes. So I told him that my company would pay for both our plane tickets, and if we stayed with his parents, then they'd even give me the extra cash that they would have spent on hotels. If money was the only reason he didn't want to go, then that excuse wouldn't work. He got this really strange expression and then said, "Fine, we'll go see my parents." So a week later, we flew into Kansas City. I rented a car and followed Tony's directions to his parents' house. The whole time he was really quiet. Then, when we were just a few minutes away from the house, he said, "Chris, there's something I need to tell you." My heart dropped. I knew that he was keeping something from me. "What is it?" I asked. My parents know all about you. I talk to them all the time, but they think that you're a woman." I almost drove off the road. "What?" "I never told them that I was gay, so whenever I talk about you, I let them think that you're my girlfriend. So when we get there, it might be a little awkward at first." "You couldn't tell them before we came all this way," I screamed. "I'm sorry." That was all he said. Very soon after that, we pulled into the driveway. His mom Carol and his dad Steve were standing in the front yard, smiling. His brother Tom was there too. When we parked, all three of them ran toward the car. Tony got out first and they hugged him. I waited a second, a little afraid of their reaction, and then I got out of the car. "This is Chris," Tony said. All three of them stared at me for the longest time. I thought they were going to freak out. And then his mom Carol shouted, "My, you're handsome! Come here!" And she wrapped me in a big hug. Steve walked over and shook my hand, and Tom stayed off to the side, but he waved and said, "Not what I expected, but really nice to meet you." They guided us both inside, and Carol gave me a quick tour of the place. She even showed me Tony's childhood bedroom, which she'd kept the same since he was a kid. It still had posters of superheroes on the walls. Honestly, everyone seemed so friendly. They asked me about my job and my family, and Carol kept complimenting my good looks. She said I looked like a young Cary Grant, whatever that meant. I didn't see Tom a lot because he mostly stayed outside, talking on the phone. But whenever he came in, he was super nice too. While we were eating dinner, I whispered to Tony, "I can't believe you never told them you were gay. They seem totally cool with it." "I know," he said. His voice sounded suspicious, especially my brother. I thought he'd be angry. I looked over at Tom, who was smiling at me from across the table. He didn't seem angry at all. I helped Carol clean up after dinner, and then Tom came over to talk to me privately. He said that he'd like to take me and Tony out to see the town and meet some of his friends. I agreed right away, but when I told Tony about it, he didn't seem too excited. "I don't really like his friends," he said. "They're a little tough." I didn't know what he meant by tough, but I told him that he needed to start trusting people. His family was cool with our relationship, so his friends should be too. Tom took us to a country western bar on the edge of town. It was not my scene, at all, but it felt like a traditional Kansas City place to be, so I decided to have some fun. We met three of Tom's friends. Tony acted coldly to them, I guess because they'd bullied him back in high school, but I tried to be nice. We drank for a while, and then Tony excused himself to go to the bathroom. Tom and his friends turned to me and asked if they could show me something outside. I didn't even ask them what. I just said sure. We walked into the parking lot. It was a beautiful starry night. "So what did you want to show me?" I asked. Instead of answering me, all four of the men grabbed my arms and started dragging me around the side of the building. They took me to a rocky field behind the bar. I tried to pull myself free, but Tom hit me in the back of the head and told me to keep walking. They took me to a giant hole in the middle of the field. It looked like the entrance to an abandoned mine. "What are you doing?" I screamed. "You changed my brother," Tom said. "You made him that way." So I guess I was wrong about Tom. He didn't accept me at all. They started shoving me toward the mine shaft. It was dark inside, but it sure looked like a sudden and steep drop. I had the feeling that if they pushed me in there, I'd be stuck down there forever. I might not even survive the fall. They pushed me closer and closer. I begged for my life. "Don't do this, please. I didn't do anything to you." "You never should have come here," Tom said, and all his friends did was laugh. They pushed me closer. My sneakers skidded across the rocky ground. I braced myself, and then I saw a sudden movement to my side. One of Tom's friends had lost his footing and fallen into the mine shaft, and then another one fell, and then the third one, but they didn't fall on their own. Tony had found us. He'd pushed them all in. "Get away from my boyfriend," he screamed. Now it was just us and Tom. You killed them," Tom muttered. "Oops," Tony said, and with one final shove, he slammed against Tom and sent him falling into the hole too. Tom screamed all the way down. "Are they going to be okay?" I asked. I had no idea how deep that hole was, but I couldn't hear any voices coming from the bottom. Tony shrugged. "Let's go home." He got in Tom's car. Thankfully, he had the keys, and we drove back to his parents' house. Neither of us said anything on the way back. When we got back inside, Carol asked where Tom was. "He and his buds decided to keep drinking," Tony explained. "They were pretty drunk when we left. I saw them hanging out behind the bar." Carol's eyes widened. "Isn't it dangerous back there? There's that mine." "I'm sure he'll be fine," Tony said. The next day I went to my conference, and then Tony and I flew back to California. No one ever saw Tom again. Tom's death was ruled an accident. No one bothered to question us. And since then, Tony and I have been back to visit his parents several times, including last Thanksgiving. They both like me a lot, but they have no idea that I was there when their son fell to his death. Last summer, I went to stay with my aunt and uncle in Colorado. They lived in this beautiful cabin up in the mountains. Growing up, I was always close to my Aunt Joyce. I always saw her as the fun aunt, the one who'd let me watch scary movies even though my mom told her not to. When I was growing up, I saw Aunt Joyce a lot, but then she married her second husband, Michael, and moved away to Colorado. After that, I only saw her a couple times, and things just weren't the same. Michael was super religious, and it felt like some of his beliefs were brushing off on her. She stopped being fun. I came out to the family 2 years ago, and Joyce was the only relative who didn't say anything. Everyone else showed their support, but Joyce just ignored my texts. I worried that her and Michael would cut me out of their lives since I was gay, but then last summer, she called me out of nowhere and asked if I wanted to come up and stay with them for a few weeks. When I got there, Aunt Joyce gave me a big hug and said she loved me. It felt like she was back to being her old self. Uncle Michael shook my hand and gave me a tour of the house. He seemed stern as always, but he was also pretty welcoming. Right away, I knew that this was going to be a good trip. I'd finally reconnect with my fun aunt. We stayed in the cabin for a couple days, catching up and playing board games. Aunt Joyce asked me about my life, and I told her all about school. I even mentioned my boyfriend, Miguel. She said she was happy for me, and she even asked to see his photos. I was so happy that she approved. On the third day, though, something terrible happened. Uncle Michael was outside on the porch. I don't know what he was doing, but he tripped and fell over the railing. He rolled a bit down the mountain and broke his leg. I was the first one to see him, and I almost threw up. His leg was twisted at an awful angle, and there was blood everywhere. I ran inside to get Aunt Joyce. She raced to him while I stayed behind. I could hear her scream, and then Uncle Michael started saying these awful things. I knew we shouldn't have invited him. God is punishing us. Stuff like that. Aunt Joyce helped me get him into the car, and then they drove to the hospital. They didn't even say goodbye, so that's how I ended up being home alone at my aunt's house. I didn't have a car to go anywhere, and when I tried to call Joyce on my cell, she didn't answer. I didn't know what to do. I figured they'd call me to fill me in, but I didn't hear from them all day. By nighttime, I was still there, alone. I waited. The cabin had seemed so welcoming and comfortable before, but by myself, I started to notice all the weird decorations on the walls. They had crosses and framed Bible passages, which weren't too strange, but they also had these really bloody figurines of Jesus and some other saints that had been blinded and stuck with spears and stuff. And when I took the time to read the Bible passages on the wall, they were all about hell and damnation. At 11, I finally got a call from Aunt Joyce. Her voice sounded shaky, and she said, "We made a grave mistake. Please stay there. Don't leave. Our friends will come soon." Before I could reply, she hung up. I had no idea what she meant. Clearly, she was worried about her husband, but she really sounded unhinged. By midnight, I heard a car park right outside. I went to the window and realized that it wasn't just one car, it was 5. At least a dozen people came out, all wearing suits and dresses, church clothes. These were the friends that Joyce had mentioned. They all walked to the front door and their faces were really serious. I knew that Aunt Joyce would have wanted me to go outside and let them in, but I got a really weird feeling about this. They did not look friendly at all. They looked like they were on a mission. That's when I realized that Joyce and her husband had gone against their church's beliefs when they invited me into their house, and they believed my presence here was the reason that Michael got hurt. I wasn't even close to him when he fell. I guess they just saw it as a sign from God. I had no idea what their church friends were planning to do to me, but it couldn't be good. I ran to the front of the house and made sure the door was locked, and then I looked around for a place to hide. I ended up finding a small closet under the stairs. The door was only about 4 feet tall, but the space was big enough for me to fit inside. I crawled into the tiny closet and closed the door. I waited as quietly as I could as Aunt Joyce's church friends unlocked the front door and came inside. I could hear them whispering to each other. I could hear their plodding footsteps. "It's all right, son," one of the men called. "Come out. We aren't here to hurt you. We just want to help." I could tell by his voice that I couldn't trust him. I waited for the longest time as the people searched through the entire cabin. I could hear them open doors and toss things around. One woman said, "He might have run into the woods." And then another woman said, "No, he's still here." I covered my mouth so they wouldn't hear me, but it was hard to keep quiet. My heart was pounding and I could barely breathe. And then someone grabbed the door and pulled it open. It was an older, bald man. He looked down at me and smiled coldly. "Everyone, I found him. Come here." He reached down to grab me, but I pushed my way past him and ran into the living room. A few more of the church friends tried to grab me, but I shoved them off and ran out the front door. I saw all their cars parked in front of the house. I hoped that one of them still had the keys inside. I tried the first car, but it was locked. The second one was too, then the third. I knew that it was hopeless. I couldn't use any of these cars, and I couldn't just run into the woods. We were miles away from any other houses, and I had no idea what direction to go. I was trapped here, but just in case, I tried one more car, and I gasped. The door was unlocked and the driver had left the keys sitting on the passenger seat. By then, all the church members were racing toward me. I didn't have any time to wait. I jumped into the car and stuck the key in the ignition. In seconds, I was backing down the driveway. Several people were pounding on the windows. The bald man who had first found me in my hiding place screamed, "Where are you going? We were just going to take you to the hospital." But I didn't believe that for a second. I kept driving. Soon I'd pulled onto the main road and was speeding back toward the city. I ended up driving to the police station where I told an officer what had happened. He acted sympathetic, but he told me that I wasn't hurt, and no crime had been committed except for the vehicle I stole. I couldn't believe it. He was siding with my aunt's crazy church friends. That's when I noticed that he had a Bible sitting on his desk. He said he'd call my aunt, but if the car's owner decided to press charges, he'd arrest me. A few minutes later, Aunt Joyce rushed into the station. Her expression was blank, but she wouldn't look me in the eyes. I asked her if she'd sent her friends to hurt me, and she said no. They were just trying to help. And how were they going to help, I asked. She didn't have an answer to that. "Look," I told her, "there's a train station just a few blocks away. If you just let me go, I promise to never visit you again." "Okay," she said, and that's it. I left. I never found out how bad Uncle Michael's injuries were. I never found out what Joyce's friends were planning to do to me. After that day, no one in my family ever heard from her or her husband again. And I think that's for the best. I came out to my parents last April and it did not go well. I thought they'd be chill about it. I was very wrong. I sat my parents down and told them that I was gay. My dad got really quiet and didn't say anything, but my mom completely flipped. She jumped off the couch and started screaming. I was so surprised by the whole thing that I don't even remember what she said. Except for the last part. She told me to get out. I couldn't believe it. Out of everybody, my mom had no right to kick out her only son. When she was my age, her parents kicked out her older brother, Dirk. It wasn't the same situation, of course. He'd gotten into some gang problems, and after he'd been arrested for shoplifting or something, my grandparents cut him off completely. Whenever my mom mentioned my Uncle Dirk, she always got really sad and said that she wished her parents had handled things differently. And now here she was, doing the exact same thing to her own child. It was really messed up. I was still in high school at the time, so I didn't have any money to get a place on my own, but I had plenty of friends that I could stay with. I very quickly gathered up all my stuff and left. I didn't even get to say goodbye to anyone. Once I'd gotten out of the house, I called my best friend Stacy to ask if I could crash at her place. I didn't even have to explain what happened. She could tell from my voice that I'd just been kicked out. Her parents liked me a lot, so there wasn't any problem with me spending the rest of the school year in their basement. After I moved in with Stacy, I didn't hear from either of my parents. The next few weeks were the worst weeks of my life. Stacy and her family were super supportive, but they were the only ones who knew that I'd been kicked out. I didn't tell any of my other friends in school. I think a couple of them knew that something was off, because it was hard for me to hide how depressed I was. But I didn't tell anyone the truth, and no one ever asked. Then one weekend, Stacy and her family decided to go visit her grandparents a few hours away. They invited me to go with them, but I didn't want to intrude. I already felt like I owed them so much. So they left on Friday night and let me spend the weekend by myself in their house. I read a little and watched some movies. Nothing too interesting. But then on Saturday night, I got a text. It was from my mom. She said, "Cody, I'm so sorry about everything. Please come home." I knew right away that something was off. My mom always used emojis when she texted. She abbreviated a lot of stuff too. This message didn't sound like her at all. I responded, "Who is this?" She responded, "It's your mom, sweetie. Come home." My mom never called me sweetie. This was obviously an imposter, but the messages were coming from her phone. I decided not to respond, but then a minute later she wrote, "Where are you? Why aren't you home right now?" A chill ran down my spine. "You know why I'm not there." She didn't respond for a while, and then she again asked me where I was. I figured she knew that I was staying at one of my friend's houses, but she didn't know which one. I wouldn't tell her anything. I was imagining the worst, that she'd hired some sort of counselor to come find me and scare me straight. Maybe that was the person texting me. I worried that if I told her where I was, she'd take me to a therapy camp or something. I decided the best thing to do was to just ignore any other messages she sent. She sent one more message demanding that I come home. And then nothing. I put my phone down and tried to forget about it, but I couldn't shake my uneasy feeling. After weeks of no contact, getting text messages that were clearly not written by my mom seemed very strange. I tried watching another movie, but I just couldn't concentrate. After a while, I turned off the TV and decided to walk to my house. I knew that was a stupid idea, but I figured that I could just hide in the bushes around my backyard and try to see if something was going on inside. No one would see me, and I'd be able to tell if there was some pastor or preacher or someone waiting for me to come back. I just needed to get some answers, so I pulled on my coat and walked down the street. My house was 3 blocks away, and as I walked there, I made sure to stick to the shadows. When I arrived, I snuck into the back and tried to look through the windows. Thankfully, the lights were on, so I could see clearly inside. I saw both my parents sitting on the sofa. It seemed normal, but as I looked closer, I saw that they were both tied up. And then a tall man walked into the room. He was covered in tattoos and carrying a gun. He was holding them hostage. It didn't take me long to realize that this was my long-lost Uncle Dirk. Despite years of hard living, his face was recognizable. He looked a bit like my mom. He shouted something at my parents, but I couldn't make out the words. I got closer to the window so I could hear. "Please," my mom said, "just take whatever you want and leave." "I don't want your stuff," my uncle screamed. "All I want is to destroy your perfect family. It's not fair that you have everything and I have nothing. Now tell me where your son is." He cocked the gun. This was insane. My uncle wanted to kill my entire family because he was jealous of us. If he only knew how imperfect we really were. I dug my phone out of my pocket and called 911. I told the policewoman my address and then hung up before my uncle could hear me through the window. But I was too late. I looked back into the living room and I saw my uncle's furious face staring at me through the glass. With one punch, he broke the window and grabbed me by the neck before I could move. I punched wildly, trying to get him off me, but he wouldn't let go. He pulled me through the broken window and into the house. He didn't realize that I grabbed a jagged piece of broken glass on the way, and once I was inside, I slashed at him. He dropped the gun and dove at me. I slashed at him again. "Don't hurt my family!" I screamed. He threw me to the ground. The glass fell out of my hand. As he stood over me, he reached to the side and grabbed his gun. He kept repeating the same thing. "Perfect family, perfect family." I knew he was going to kill me. He was going to kill us all. But suddenly the front door burst open and 2 policemen rushed inside. They forced Uncle Dirk to drop his gun, and then they cuffed him and led him away. After a 3rd policeman untied my parents, my mom ran toward me and wrapped me in a big hug. "You're okay," she said. "You saved us." "Yeah, I could tell that the texts weren't coming from you, so I came over," I told her. "That was Uncle Dirk, huh?" "Yes," she said. "He just got released from jail. I had no idea he hated us so much." She hugged me tighter. I could tell she was crying. She apologized for kicking me out and begged me to forgive her. She wanted me to come back home. She said she accepted me the way I was. Dad was standing off to the side, still not saying anything, but he was smiling at me, waiting for my answer. "Thanks," I told them, "but I'm not ready to come back. I'm glad you're safe now, but you're going to have to earn my trust again." And I left. I went back to Stacy's house and went to bed. Since then, I've been talking to my parents more and more. I still haven't forgiven them for kicking me out. But I'm starting to. After all, they'll always be family.